So we finally got our first look at Pokemon Legends ZA, and that includes our first look at its starters, Chikorita, Tepig, and Totodile. I'm a little miffed that Piplup isn't in the lineup, but maybe we can talk about that in a later video, and I like Totodile anyway, so I guess this is fine. Of course, if Pokemon Legends Arceus taught us anything, it's that they'll be doing something new and interesting with the starters they chose. What could that be? Let's talk about it. Of course, before we start, comment down below which starter you plan on picking. Personally, I'll be going with Chikorita, if you're curious. You probably weren't, though. Pokemon Legends Arceus took place in a region called Hisui, and it introduced regional Hisuian forms for its evolved starters, Decidueye, Typhlosion, and Samurai. Therefore, I don't think Kalosian regional forms for Meganium, Embor, and Feraligatr are out of the question, but we'll get more into that in a bit. Regional variants so far have had one rule, to change the original's typing in some way, and Pokemon Legends Arceus thus far has set the precedent that the original typing must be preserved in some way, i.e. the hypothetical Kalosian, Meganium, Embor, and Feraligatr will be grass, fire, and water respectively, just not purely those types. Let's discuss the possibilities. In the case of Meganium, I can think of two strong possibilities, but before we get into that, we need to talk about today's sponsor, Raid Shack. But before we get into that, I think it would be wise to talk about Meganium as we know it. Meganium sucks. I know some of you watching this video probably aren't big into Pokemon, but all you need to know is that the longer the bar in this image, the more emphasis that Pokemon places on that stat. So Meganium is trying to be more defensive than offensive. And this makes sense with its ability Leaf Guard, which makes it immune to status effects if harsh sunlight is the current weather condition. There's a decent foundation here, but there's one huge problem. Its Soul Grass typing is terrible defensively, and even if it weren't, there isn't really much it can do with its defenses because its move pool has nothing interesting in it. So what could Kalosian Meganium get? As I said before, there's two possibilities for its secondary typing, the first of which is Dragon. Meganium is a flower dinosaur, and I can't imagine a new variant veering too far away from that, so it's an interesting possibility that would do a lot for it defensively, giving it double resistances to a lot of strong offensive types and taking away its weakness to fire. However, the far likelier possibility is Fairy, and for a few reasons. One, as I said previously, is a flower dinosaur, and a certain flower Pokemon, which so happens to be Fairy type, is featured pretty prominently in this game. Secondly, as we see in the trailer, Chikorita gets Disarming Voice, a Fairy-type move it couldn't previously learn. And the best part is, Grass and Fairy is actually a decent defensive typing that would somewhat lean into what Meganium wants to do. Double weaknesses like the one it has to Poison are never fun, but Poison is one of the worst offensive types in the game right now, so unless something big happens, I don't really see that as a huge worry. But yeah, my money is on Grass and Fairy because it's fun and functional. Next up is Embor, and since I don't know much about pigs in French history, I decided to look it up and... oh. That aside, the trailers give us much less to work with for Tepig and Totodile compared to Chikorita. We see it use Rollout, but it already had that. However, if we refer to the official Pokemon Legends ZA website, we find this little blurb. Tepig is nimbler than it looks. It uses its speed to confound enemies, dodging their attacks with agility and rapidly launching fireballs from both nostrils. That might suggest perhaps fire and flying, but it's not so cut and dry. Tepig has had Pokédex entries referencing its dodging abilities dating back to Pokemon Black and White, its debut games, and this blurb is almost word for word from its Pokemon Scarlet Pokédex entry. Perhaps they changed the phrasing with this game in mind, but I don't know, it doesn't seem too likely to me. I think a stronger likelihood would be Fire and Steel, and there's two different possibilities that could lead to this outcome. Possibility one is that they lean harder into Embor's Sumo motif. This change would give it what's called the same type attack bonus on Heat Crash and Heavy Slam, a Fire and Steel type move respectively, and two moves based on body slamming your opponents really hard, which, and I don't know if you know this, but wrestlers kind of do that. An alternative possibility is that crowns are made of metal. French King Louis XVI was depicted as a pig in various works of art, so perhaps they'll base Kalosian Embor on royalty, earning it the steel typing either way. Another possibility is Fire and Dark, which is what some people thought Embor was going to be originally, but there isn't really much to base that theory on, so we're just going to move on. Lastly, we've got Kalosian Feraligatr. Totodile is in the same boat as Tepig in that the trailer gave us nothing to really work with, but what makes the two different is that the website gives Totodile nothing to work with either. However, just because we're out of evidence doesn't mean we're out of options. If you look up sewer alligators, you'll find that a common urban legend is that alligators can be found in the sewers of New York City and, get this, Paris. And the Kalos region is based on France, which is where Paris happens to be located. And Lumio City, which this game takes place in, is particularly based on Paris. Sewers have a lot of waste in them, so water and poison isn't that unlikely. Defensively, water and poison is fantastic. We previously discussed that poison isn't a great offensive type, so that part isn't great, but poison is super effective against fairy, the best type in the game, so that's a huge plus. And it does give them some coverage against grass types, which are otherwise a problem for water types. It's kind of the only pluses, but I think the only major downside here is that since regular Feraligatr already has Sheer Force, Kalosian Feraligatr wouldn't be too likely to get it. And that's a shame, since Sheer Force and a Life Orb boosting a same type attack bonus Gunk Shot would have been sick. No pun intended. The secondary possibility I have less stake in would be Water and Dark. Let's get the big negative out of the way. Hisuian Samurott was already Water and Dark, and I don't think they would double up like that again. Yeah, I know, Fire and Fighting already got spammed for 3 generations in a row, but you notice they haven't really done that since. I think they realize that people find repeat type combinations uninteresting. That being said, Feraligatr does have an affinity for biting, and biting moves are predominantly Dark type with 3 options in Bite, Crunch, and Jaw Lock. There's also the Water type move Vicious Wren that, while Feraligatr doesn't learn it, maybe it could. As far as abilities for the 3 go, I don't really have too many ideas. I imagine Meganium might end up in a Hisuian Samurott situation of getting an ability that doesn't currently exist, since there's nothing really out there at the moment that would be of big help to it. Chlorophyll is a notable exception, but all that would really do is make it a worse Venusaur, and nobody really wins with that. If Embor gets the Steel typing, I could see it potentially getting Heavy Metal, an ability that increases its weight to make Heat Crash and Heavy Slam even more potent. I think the big one is Feraligatr though. Strongjaw came out after Feraligatr got its hidden ability Sheer Force, and since Sheer Force is actually really good in general and a competent option on it in particular, they probably didn't see any need to replace it. However, a regional Feraligatr doesn't have that problem. If it doesn't get Strongjaw, I'll be frankly amazed. Now, before we end the video, another possibility we need to discuss is Mega Evolution. For anyone coming into this from the outside, Mega Evolution is basically a transformation certain Pokemon can use to become much stronger. In its debut games, Pokemon X and Y, Mega Evolution could not be used by that game's evolved starters, but instead by Red and Blue's evolved starters of Venusaur, Charizard, and Blastoise, all 3 of which were also obtainable in those games. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire changed this up a bit by letting its evolved starters use Mega Evolution. All of this is to say, it's hard to tell if Game Freak intends to go this route with Pokemon Legends ZA's starters. So far they have not shown any new Mega Evolutions, but that doesn't mean there won't be any. Additionally, it seems cruel to give Mega Evolutions to Chikorita and Totodile but not to Cyndaquil. And lastly, Mega Evolution is a returning mechanic. It hasn't been available in the last few games, and it's unlikely it will be available in future games either. The upcoming Pokemon Champions game rectifies this somewhat by seemingly making every mechanic available at the same time, but that too will pass. Not giving Meganium, Embor, and Feraligatr a regional variant, which would last indefinitely, to instead give them Mega Evolutions, which likely won't, would be an ill-advised move. Of course, there is the possibility that Kalosian variants of those 3 just get Mega Evolutions, which would be the best of both worlds. Unless they lean on the Mega Evolutions to make those 3 any good, then it would be a bad thing. But let me know what you think down in the comments below, and if you want me to cover this upcoming game some more, since I think there's a lot more to talk about. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like, and maybe even consider subscribing if you'd like to see more. Until then, see you around.